As part of Mental Health Week in 2020, the Fellowship of Australian Writers Queensland sat down with people from different backgrounds to discuss how the creative art of writing helped build resilience in their life. Jodie Lane, queer single mother and author of the Turning Points time travel adventure series of novels, begins by discussing a short story she wrote called The Job.
The Job was a submission for an anthology called Obliquity, where we were invited to submit a short story with a bit of a skew-F meaning, a bit of a hidden meaning, which short stories often are. So for me, writing about The Job, it wasn't immediately obvious what this job was, but I described the main character really having a hard time of it. It was a challenging new job. It was a job that she wanted, but it hadn't turned out quite like she expected.
Because the boss was so demanding.
You described so demanding. The hours were crazy. The expectations changed from minute to minute, and she was really struggling, but she was too embarrassed, ashamed, proud to tell anyone she was struggling, because she had wanted that job and she didn't quite know how to say, this isn't everything I expected it to be. So that short story is about how she was struggling and ended up being in a really dark place because of it and because of the boss. At the end of the story, you realise she's talking about having a new baby and how that 24/7 demanding, exhausting, nothing can prepare you for it. I thought having a dog was a good start to having a baby. Oh, yeah, I've got to care for this animal. I've got to, I love them. I care about what happens to them. There's nothing on the exhaustion you experience. And then the feelings of depression I had that I wasn't good enough at this job that I'd wanted.
So The Job, the short story, was really about your experience with your first child.
Very much so.
Yes.
And I experienced some very dark thoughts at the time, which I hid because I was so frightened and ashamed. And I still to this day, I struggle to tell people how bleak my mind was at the time. But in writing that story, it was very cathartic in that it got some of that voice out, and it was a bit of a cry for help. By that point, I already was receiving some help, fortunately. I was very, very lucky.
So you found the writing process, the actual writing of that story, in some way a release?
Absolutely.
And a healing process?
Definitely. I could still feel that darkness within me, but I wasn't drowning in it. I wasn't choking on it anymore. And in being able to articulate some of it, it took away some of its power. And it also had the added benefit of connecting me with other people. People got in touch because it was published in the Obliquity anthology, but I also videoed myself and put it up on Facebook. And the number of people I had, friends and even strangers, reaching out to me either publicly or through private messages saying, I understand, I was there too.
So it's that sense of connection, you
Yes.
think, that is really the journey. And to what extent did your writing journey then take off from there in terms of making more connections with other people?
Well, that's the irony, is that writing is traditionally a very solitary activity, and a lot of us are introverts, but it has actually connected me with more people and really expanded my horizons in how people think, and also expanding my own horizons in how I think. So it began with the fiction, with the history, which I will talk about, but it's that mental health side of things, because depression, as I think you're aware, Jim, is one of the most isolating things you'll ever experience, being trapped in your own head. So being able to connect with people, it also gave me that sense of identity away from being a mother. So I'm a well-travelled, well-spoken, tertiary educated young woman who was slave to this little creature who screamed and cried and didn't sleep and was incessant. And even when he did sleep, I was too wound up. I was too anxious to rest myself. My mind was always going. I could never switch off. So writing definitely gave me a sense of identity outside of being a new mother, and that honestly saved my life.
So your sense of your sense of yourself,
Yes.
when you're travelling, is something that is connected to all the things that are around you. But when you have a commitment to one person, like your own child,
Yes.
that connection becomes almost overwhelming.
Yes.
It's
But there's still a definite amount of shame in not to admit that you resent your own child goes against the warm fuzziness that we're sold, because there is a lot of warm fuzziness. There can be a lot of wonderful things, but it's, in myself in particular, I felt like I wasn't good enough because I wasn't always happy.
It's that sense of judgment
Yes.
that that the external world puts on you, that you started to look at in terms of history. Your series, the Turning Point series,
Yes.
goes through various stages in history and takes real events,
Yes.
but talks about them from the point of view of what if something happened that
Differently.
would change.
Yes, absolutely. I love the idea that humans tend to act in patterns, and there are broad socioeconomic forces that have shaped our history, but there are some points, you'd almost call it a nexus of opportunity, where things could have gone very differently, and I choose interesting events to write about where, for one reason or another, history could have gone very, very differently. I like exploring that idea of what has shaped our present, what might shape our future, and how even one person can influence that in a very subtle and unseen way.
And it's even, in a sense,
The way in which he was diagnosed.
Yes.
History.
What they did is they got the whole
In the
family.
first novel, you talk about the Siege of Masada.
Yes.
And really, all that we know about the Siege of Masada is from the Roman historian.
Yes. I did actually read Josephus's book and as some of my primary research, as well as researching other... there has been some archaeological digs there. It's quite a popular tourist site in Israel, and I've been there. So the research I did with regards to what is factually there in terms of the Roman ramp that was built and where the where forces would have been concentrated, where the gates were and things like that. But the rest of it I can kind of run with, and I compressed the timeline of the Siege of Masada to suit the narrative of the book, and I acknowledge that in my author notes. I try keep things as factually accurate as I can, except where it suits the story, because it is historical fiction and I'm trying to convey a feeling rather than just dry facts.
And of course, history itself is in some ways a story.
It is.
From the perspective of the writer.
Yes.
In your first book, there's your protagonist, Gwyn,
Yes.
comes across a piece of equipment that enables her to travel back in time.
Yes.
Almost accidentally.
Yes.
And Gwyn is travelling through the area of what was then, when she went back, ancient Judea. At that time, you were there as well with your family?
Yes. So when I was 14, my father was working in Israel for a month, and the rest of the family flew over to join him. We travelled for a week around Israel. So the first 2 chapters of that book are very closely based on my family's travels in Israel. And we went to Masada one day. So in thinking about a time and a place that I've been, and a time that I was interested in, Masada was excellent because I could bring my mind back to how it felt when I was there on that day, and it was hot and it was bleak, and you can see the ruins of some of the Roman camps as you look down from the walls. We actually walked up the main Roman ramp on the western side to access the fortress. So while battles are a very good example of turning points, there are other incidences in history that could have shaped how things could have gone.
One of those you go into the next one, and one of the important people in history that you take your characters into in the next book is that period of time in Transylvania.
Yes.
Where we had Vlad Dracula.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about him, and especially in terms of who it was that he became connected with in your novel?
Yes. So Vlad is a very interesting historical figure, and some of the research I was doing, there was points of view where he's a very strong nationalist figure. He was fighting for his country. He was fighting to keep the Ottoman Empire to the east, and then you had Catholic Europe to the west. Other points of view straight out call him a psychopath, and because I'm very interested in mental health and also in entitlement and violence, particularly in how people justify violence. So he was a fascinating character to write. He's definitely not black and white, and he acted as a buffer between these two empires. Some of the things he did were horrific, but there's always people who feel like they can argue, oh, but he did it for this reason, for that reason, and justify it. So I find it very interesting to explore that mentality of why people do things.
So you go into your third book, into ancient Rome, and you take some of the characters who were there in Masada, meet up again in ancient Rome. Do you want to talk about their relationship with your protagonist, Gwyn?
To Kill an Emperor is set 20 years after the siege of Masada. Only a few months have gone past for Gwyn. So when she runs into two people who she actually made friends with in Masada, a Jewish girl and a young Roman soldier, it is interesting to see how their lives have changed, how that imperialism of Rome has affected the people around it. And it also lets her, she's grown as a person since then, but not as much as they have. They're 20 years older, they have families, and there's definitely an interesting dynamic of her having to re-establish her friendships with them. It is great getting to revisit these characters because character development is something that absolutely fascinates me. It comes back to that human psychology of how we grow under trauma, under adversity. And I even wrote a short story about Gaius and Adi, what happened to them after Masada, but before To Kill an Emperor, and how they established their lives and moved on from this horrific trauma they'd endured.
That connection that Gwyn makes with them, you explore very much. There's a strong element of both the male and the female strength in all through them.
She was
We'll talk about that
and converted to Catholicism.
that aspect of the diversity
Yes.
that is in each of us.
Absolutely. I love writing strong female characters, and it comes back to wanting to be a strong mother for my daughter. Having a son first was actually very good for me because it forced me to embrace some of my feminine strengths and not actually see them as weaknesses. So with a variety of characters who also have a variety of sexual orientations, I get to explore how you can be strong and weak in male and female ways. So having both of those aspects either across different characters or within the same characters is very interesting, because as a modern young woman, modern to us from our time, dealing with some of the prejudices, some of the dangers in different times, and assessing them against our own time, Gwyn is very confronted by how she's treated, how she has to behave, that goes against... It irks her, frankly, and she pushes against that, but also has to survive, which a lot of people do today, men and women.
One of those prejudices is the topic, to a large extent, of your fourth book, Renaissance Woman.
Yes.
Where you have as one of your characters the Borgia Pope.
Yes.
Who not only had mistresses and children,
yes,
but was the one who fought most for celibacy among the priests in his church.
Rodrigo Borgia is a very interesting person. His hypocrisy is incredible, and he used his influence very much so. One of his sons he made a cardinal, the other one was the general of the papal armies. He married his daughter Lucrezia off several times. Her name is often synonymous with a kind of Jezebel, though you have to remember that she was a young teen the first time she was married. She didn't get a choice in it, and when her father decided to annul the marriage and marry her elsewhere for political gain, she didn't have a whole lot of choice in it. So his hypocrisy is fascinating because he was very self-interested, very interested in his own family, but he did actually go some way towards serving the people that he led as well. So that male and female elements of who held power, who had his ear. One of his mistresses was very influential, but he came up against a lot of challenge as well, and was hated. His successor, Julius II, tried to obliterate his memory.
So that sense of history that you're talking about there, where the people do what we would classify as awful things to protect other people. There's that element all through the Turning Point series that comes from what Michelle, your character from the future, is trying to solve in some way.
Michelle is a time-space agent from about 600 years in our future, and her job is to make sure some of these turning points go the right way, so history turns the right way, because she's protecting her own present, and she sees what her worlds as a better future for humanity and for other species. So at first she's actually quite dismissive of some of the people in the past. It's why historical drama is so popular in television and in books, because we can vicariously enjoy the intrigue and the violence and everything, but we're distanced from it's sex and violence in a pretty costume. We're distanced from it in a way that would be quite difficult if it was right in our faces, as we see it now. So Michelle's growth as a character is not perhaps as obvious as Gwyn's, but she still has to learn to be more empathetic and get in touch with her more human side instead of just treating people like pawns.
So there's a sense in which Michelle has to grow
absolutely
in sensitivity.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas Gwyn, your other character, has to grow in a sense...
Sisters and brothers.
Yes.
His own brother.
So do you want to just talk about how each of those characters relate to your own experience in terms of your writing, about the way in which you expressed part of yourself in Gwyn and Michelle?
As I mentioned, becoming a mother was my own sort of turning point, because it forced me to look at myself in ways that I hadn't done before. I had a massive identity shift in where my value lay, my own perceptions of self-worth, which are still changing and still growing. It was a catalyst for change in my life. Writing has let me explore voices that I agree with and don't agree with, and let me try on versions of myself to see what feels right, to basically grow as a person and be a happier version of myself. Happy is a fairly trite word, but a more true version of myself.
So a more honest version.
Yes.
And it's that sense of self-awareness
Yes.
that you find in the writing process is helping you to grow.
It has helped me all along. Integrity is one of my core values, and to be honest to yourself, you first need to work out who you are. And that has been a big part of the journey for the last 5 years for me, becoming a parent, changing jobs. I separated from my marriage at the end of last year, embracing my queer side, dating men and women, and just being more comfortable in my own skin, not feeling I have to present a certain face to the world to be accepted, because for so long I was so frightened of not being worth anything because I didn't feel I was worth anything.
And that stops you from really communicating not only yourself, but with yourself.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about how that sense of communication through your ability to be creative, and the writing process is a creative process,
yes,
has really helped you build that confidence in yourself?
As I said, it's let me try on voices that I didn't quite know if they were mine or not, and I was able to see what resonated, feel what resonated. It's given me greater articulacy, first through writing, but then also speaking about issues that I found challenging, confronting, uncomfortable, upsetting. No one likes being uncomfortable. It's the only way we grow. And I am very fortunate in having friends who aren't afraid to make me uncomfortable, who aren't afraid to challenge in loving ways when I'm either not making the best decisions, or even if I am making reasonable decisions, but they're still not afraid to test me on it. And I don't feel like it's an attack on myself, because I know it comes from a place of love, but it forces me to assess what I'm actually doing, be more aware of what I'm doing. There's always a part of my brain which is watching the rest of me, and even in some of my dumbest decisions, that part of my brain is very sober and very calculating and critical, not in a bad way, but it critiques my behaviour. So I'm learning to listen to that and be very aware of why I'm making the choices I'm making.
And it's that connection with those other people you just mentioned.
Yes.
That connection that you called love.
Yes.
Which is a real connection in terms of support.
Yes.
Did you want to just explain how that connection comes? Because writing is often regarded as a solitary pursuit.
It is. And ironically, post-natal depression was the most isolating experience of my life. But part of the journey was building a support net of people, and the way you connect with other people is by being vulnerable, to quote Brene Brown, whom I admire greatly. And sometimes that risks getting hurt, and that is painful and uncomfortable, and sometimes you hurt people, and that's almost worse, because I am striving to be a better version of myself, not in an over-idealistic way. I accept that better version of myself also has to accept that I have flaws, but I want that growth and I enjoy that progression and change. And so part of that support net, which initially was for mothering for me, to be able to have people to call on, go, I'm not coping today, it has been a terrible day, I hate this, why did I ever have children? And that's grown into writer friends who we can share experiences with. One of my friends, she articulated it beautifully. She's like, if we don't write the ink will bleed out our fingers. And I said, yes, absolutely, I understand that. And then just on a broader level of work relationships, friendships, intimate relationships, where I'm not afraid to be myself, to say what I want, to examine what I want and think about why I want it, and then whether I need to want it sometimes. Sometimes it's habit. We are creatures of habit, and we often react in the same way because we have just always done that. And I like that because of some of these friends, I am now able to look at myself and go, hang on, do you really need to feel like this? Can you change the narrative?
And our habits also often come from what we're told.
Yes, very much
externally. So it's a real acceptance of self and a movement away from judgment.
Yes, yes.
It's a sense in which we need to become more accepting of diversity.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's the core of your writing, do you think?
It's a theme that follows the entire book. I had certain ideas about topics I wanted to bring into the story and discuss, but it's definitely a theme that has built, it's gained its own momentum about that diversity, about differences, about how we might not always agree, but we can communicate about these differences and find a compromise, find a way through. So much of that comes back from that self-awareness and really having a good hard look at yourself and going, why am I like the way I am? Not in a, it might, I think in the past it has been viewed as fairly self-indulgent, navel-gazing, call it what you will, but it is important to be aware of why your brain reacts the way it does, why you react the way you do.
It's an acceptance of self, isn't it?
It is, back to what you said, it's an acceptance of self, because then you have the power to choose of whether you want change or not, whether you can make this decision or that decision.
And that's exactly what Brene Brown, whom you mentioned, that's what she talks about.
Yes.
That ability to be able to choose vulnerability.
Yes.
And to be open
yes.
to that.
Yes. And it's scary. It is scary. And it helps finding those people who are accepting and loving, even if they don't always understand, but who will stand by you even when you're making stupid decisions. And I've done plenty of those. And I've had friends who are not afraid to tell me, that's a dumb idea, but I'll still be here. I'll tell you I told you so, but I will still be here for you. I'll be at your back. And it lets you practice that vulnerability. I am a big advocate of anything worth achieving in this life is worth practicing, whether it's learning another language, whether it's taking up a sport, practicing communicating, practicing emotional intelligence. It's all worth practicing, because the more you do it, the easier it gets.
So you never give up.
You never give up. It's okay for other people to help you up. I think you might understand a bit about that, Jim, your own experiences of depression.
Your writing journey is the thing that really helps you see, not only reflecting on the past and understanding that, but then an acceptance of it and an understanding of where you are now.
Yes.
And then you can look with hope to the future.
But
your writing
the way in
journey is continuing?
It is. I haven't been writing much this year because there has been a lot going on, but it has been wonderful to be able to pause, take breath, reflect, and also absorb. I've been doing a lot more reading than I have the last 5 or 6 years, because I finished my 5-book series. I've written a number of short stories and a novella. I jot down things now and then for fun, and I will continue to write, but this year has been great for taking that moment, checking in on where I'm at, how I'm feeling, and actually putting into practice some of the things that I've learnt with regards to communicating and being vulnerable and making connections with other people.
We're looking forward to more writing from you, Jodie. Jodie Lane, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Jim.
And she was the one who kept my father going in Catholicism.